He left his black wife for a younger mistress, thinking he'd erased his past. But on his wedding day, she pulled up in a limo with 4 beautiful daughters who look just like him. What happened next shattered his perfect image forever. Subscribe for more true stories, and don't forget to share this video with a friend. Amara never thought the hush of a late evening could feel so wide, so restless, like a tide pushing against the walls of their small apartment just outside Atlanta. The streetlights cast long beams across the cracked sidewalk, bouncing light onto the living room curtains as they fluttered gently in the summer breeze. She stood near the window, her hand resting on the soft roundness of her belly, whispering to the life blooming inside her while the hum of cars and distant barking dogs reminded her the world was moving whether she felt ready or not. When she met Trevor at the community college's fundraising gala, she had been wearing a sky blue dress she bought secondhand, a dress she had pinned at the waist to fit her curves, hoping to feel a little more like the woman she wanted to become. Trevor had approached her with that easy confidence she mistook for warmth, a light in his gray eyes that flickered as he laughed about the overpriced wine and the stiff music the band played near the plastic floral arrangements. He was handsome, with carefully trimmed brown hair, broad shoulders that seemed made for comforting embraces, and a smile that turned heads, but it was the way he spoke of building something big. A future, a family, an empire that made her believe in him more than she believed in herself. They married in early spring, a small ceremony in a church with fading paint and cracked steps, but Amara thought it beautiful. She wore a simple white dress, her natural curls pinned back with baby's breath, and Trevor kissed her in front of a handful of family and friends. Her mother dabbed tears quietly. Her aunt hummed a hymn softly under her breath, and Trevor's parents stood stiffly, his mother's pearls catching the light as she clutched her small purse, nodding politely to Amara, but never quite meeting her eyes. Their first few months were a haze of laughter and late-night takeout, of Netflix and whispered dreams beneath thin sheets in the heat of their small bedroom. Trevor would pull her close, pressing his lips to the soft curve of her neck, murmuring that he would give her everything, that their future was bright and unstoppable if they just worked hard enough. She believed him. She held on to those words when she watched him leave every morning in his crisp shirts, his tie always a little off-center until she fixed it, waving to him as he disappeared down the street toward the city. When she found out she was pregnant, she told him with tears in her eyes, shaking hands holding the small plastic test she had double-checked 5 times before daring to believe it was true. Trevor kissed her forehead, his hand pressed to her belly as if trying to feel the life that had only just begun. But the joy in his eyes was fleeting, replaced quickly by a distant, unreadable look that made her heart tighten, even as she smiled and pressed his hand closer to her body, hoping he would feel the same hope she did. The day they went for the ultrasound, Amara clutched Trevor's hand, feeling the cold gel on her belly as the nurse moved the wand across her skin, searching, listening. Then came the words that changed everything. 4 heartbeats, 4 tiny lives fluttering inside her, each one a promise, a miracle, a terrifying, beautiful reality. Amara cried softly, laughter mixed with tears, but when she turned to Trevor, his face had drained of color, his eyes staring at the screen as if it had betrayed him, as if it had dared to ruin the vision he had carefully crafted for his life. They drove home in silence that day, the car filled with the hum of tires on pavement, the occasional rattle of a truck passing by, and the sound of Amara's quiet breathing as she tried to steady herself. She reached for his hand once, but he pulled it back to adjust the air conditioning, his jaw clenched as he stared straight ahead, and in that moment, something fragile began to crack inside her. Days turned into weeks, and Trevor's distance became a shadow that grew long across every room they shared. He came home later, the scent of unfamiliar perfume sometimes clinging faintly to his shirts, and when she asked him about it, he would laugh tightly, brushing her off with a kiss that never quite landed. His phone became a secret he guarded, turning the screen away from her as he typed quickly, locking it when he walked into the bathroom and telling her she was imagining things when she asked why he seemed so far away even when he was standing right next to her. Amara tried to hold on to hope, to the dreams they once whispered in the dark, but every day felt heavier, her body growing rounder, her ankles swelling, as she stood by the window waiting for him to come home. She began to talk to the babies, pressing her hands against her belly, telling them about the world, about the colors of the sky at dawn, the scent of rain on hot pavement, the softness of music drifting from a neighbor's window in the evening. She told them they were wanted, that they were loved, even if she was the only one saying it. Trevor's absences became longer, and the excuses thinner, like cheap cloth that tears at the slightest tug. He was working late, meeting clients, grabbing a drink with the guys, and Amara nodded, pressing her lips together to keep from begging him to stay, to talk to her, to remember the promises he made. Sometimes, late at night, she would hear him come in, the soft creak of the floorboards as he moved through the dark, the rustle of clothing as he undressed and slipped into bed beside her, the scent of whiskey and something floral drifting across the pillow as he turned his back to her, pulling the blanket around his shoulders. The day she found the photo on his phone, she was folding baby clothes, small white onesies with tiny clouds printed on them, socks so small they fit in the palm of her hand. His phone buzzed on the table, and without thinking, she picked it up, her eyes scanning the screen. There it was. A photo of Trevor, smiling with a young, light-skinned woman in a red dress, her arm hooked through his, her head leaning against his shoulder as they stood in the glow of soft restaurant lights. Amara's breath caught, a sound like a wounded animal escaping her throat, but she didn't cry. She simply put the phone back on the table, folded the onesie carefully, and placed it in the drawer. That evening, when Trevor came home, she watched him, the way his eyes darted around the room, the way he kissed her cheek lightly, avoiding her gaze. She didn't ask him about the photo, didn't confront him, because the fear of hearing the truth was worse than the silence that had settled between them like a cold wind. Instead, she turned to the window, pressing her hand to her belly, feeling the flutter of tiny feet against her palm, grounding herself in the reality of the lives she carried. It was a Tuesday morning when he finally said the words she had been dreading, standing in the small kitchen with the hum of the refrigerator the only witness. She was washing dishes, her belly brushing against the counter, warm water soothing her swollen fingers when he cleared his throat behind her. She turned, a dish towel in her hands, her heart pounding. His eyes were cold, distant, his mouth set in a hard line. "I can't do this," he said, and the world seemed to tilt, the light from the window suddenly too bright, too harsh. "What do you mean?" she managed to whisper, clutching the towel, her knuckles white. "I'm not ready for this, Amara. I need space. I need to live my life." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came, only the sound of her breath, ragged and sharp as the towel slipped from her hands and fell to the floor. Trevor didn't look at her belly, didn't look at the drawer of baby clothes, didn't look at the ultrasound photos pinned to the fridge with a flower magnet. He picked up the small bag he had packed, the zipper already strained from being overfilled, and he walked out the door, leaving it swinging open behind him as a breeze fluttered through, rustling the paper on the counter. Amara stood there, staring at the empty doorway, her hands trembling as they pressed to her belly, the soft thump of 4 tiny heartbeats reminding her she was not alone, even as the world felt like it had shattered around her feet. She moved to the window, watching as Trevor's car pulled away, the red tail lights blinking as he turned the corner, disappearing from view. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, tears finally breaking free as she rocked herself, whispering to the children inside her, telling them it would be okay, that she would find a way, that she would love them enough for both parents. Outside, the world kept moving, cars honking in the distance, children laughing as they ran down the sidewalk, the sky above bright and endless. Amara closed her eyes, pressing her forehead to her knees, letting herself grieve for the man who had promised her forever, but left when forever became too real. She allowed herself that moment of heartbreak, of loss, of fear, but as the minutes passed, as the babies shifted and kicked within her, she felt something else rising in the quiet, a quiet determination, a promise to herself and to them that she would not break, that she would rise, no matter how alone she felt. When she finally stood, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, she looked around their small apartment, at the evidence of a life they had tried to build together, and she knew it would never be the same. But it would be hers, and it would be enough. She pressed a hand to her belly, breathing deeply as the evening light spilled across the floor, warming her skin, reminding her that tomorrow was another day, and she would face it, for them, for herself, for the family that remained, even when promises were broken and dreams were shattered. Amara turned away from the window, moving slowly but steadily toward the bedroom, where the baby clothes were folded neatly in drawers, where the crib stood waiting, where hope lived, fragile but unyielding, ready to bloom even in the harshest of seasons. The dawn came quietly that morning, the sky soft and bruised with shades of violet and gray as Amara lay awake, one hand resting on her swollen belly, listening to the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant hum of the world waking beyond the thin walls of the apartment. The sheets clung to her skin, damp from another restless night where the babies moved inside her like a tide, shifting and pressing against her ribs, reminding her with every breath that they were here, that they were coming whether she felt ready or not. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of the room that still held the faint echo of Trevor's cologne, a reminder of promises made and broken, of a man who walked away before their daughters even took their first breath. It was on a Tuesday, the air heavy with the promise of rain, when Amara felt the first sharp pull in her belly, a tightening that stole her breath and left her gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, her heart pounding as she whispered to herself to breathe, to stay calm, to hold on just a little longer. The contractions came again, stronger, closer, and the fear rose in her throat, thick and hot, as she realized it was time. She reached for the small bag she had packed weeks ago, the bag that sat by the door collecting dust as she waited alone, hoping each day that she would find the strength to face what was coming. The hospital was cold, the fluorescent lights too bright as she was wheeled down the hallway, the scent of antiseptic and the low murmur of voices filling the air around her. She clutched the thin blanket over her belly, the pain coming in waves that made her grip the metal rails of the bed, her breath sharp and uneven as tears gathered in the corners of her eyes. Nurses moved around her, checking monitors, adjusting wires, speaking in calm voices that blurred into a hum as the world narrowed to the rhythm of pain and the sound of her baby's heartbeats echoing in the small room. Hours passed, marked only by the rise and fall of her breath, the squeezing of her hands around the bed rails, the whispered prayers she sent into the sterile air, begging for strength, for mercy, for her daughters to come into the world safely. She thought of Trevor, of the way he once held her hand and pressed kisses to her forehead, promising to be there for every moment, for every milestone, for every breath. She thought of the way he had walked away, of the empty doorway, of the silence that followed, and she let that pain burn away the fear, replacing it with a resolve as sharp and clear as glass. When the first baby's cry pierced the air, it was like the breaking of a storm, the sound cutting through the exhaustion and the haze of pain, bringing tears to Amara's eyes as she reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched the soft, warm skin of her daughter. One by one, they came. Each cry a note in a fragile, powerful symphony that filled the room, that filled the hollow spaces inside her where hope had once struggled to grow. They were small, so small, their tiny hands curling around her finger, their faces scrunched and red, their breaths quick and uncertain as they were wrapped in blankets and placed near her. 4 small miracles in a world that had tried to teach her to fear hope. The nurses called it rare. Quadruplets, 4 healthy baby girls born to a mother who had come alone, who had signed the forms alone, who had pressed her lips together and nodded when asked about the father, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as she refused to let them see the crack that ran through her heart. They told her she was strong, that she was brave, that she had done something incredible, but all Amara could do was hold her daughters, one at a time, pressing kisses to their foreheads, whispering their names, the names she had chosen in the quiet of the night, names that meant hope, strength, love, and light. The days that followed were a blur of soft cries and the steady beep of monitors, of nurses coming and going, of feedings and diaper changes, of Amara sitting in a hard chair by the window, holding her daughters close, rocking them gently as she hummed softly, songs her mother had once sung to her on hot summer nights when the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the chirp of crickets. She watched the sun rise through the hospital window, the sky blooming with colors that reminded her that life went on, that there was beauty even in the hardest moments, that there was a future waiting for them beyond the sterile walls of the hospital. When they were finally allowed to go home, Amara stood outside the hospital doors, the cool breeze brushing against her skin as she looked down at her daughters, each bundled in soft blankets, their faces calm in sleep, their small hands peeking out to clutch at the air. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she stepped forward, the weight of the car seat heavy in her arms, but the weight of her resolve even heavier, grounding her as she moved toward the bus stop, toward the small apartment that waited for them, toward the life she would build with them, one step at a time. The apartment felt different with the babies inside, the air filled with the soft sounds of their breathing, their cries, the quiet coos as they lay on the small blankets Amara had spread on the floor, their eyes wide as they looked around at the world for the first time. The nights were long, the cries piercing the silence, the feedings a constant rhythm that left her exhausted, her body aching, her mind foggy with the weight of sleeplessness. She rocked them, one by one, 2 at a time, sometimes all 4 crying at once, their small fists waving in the air as she whispered to them, telling them it would be all right, that she was there, that they were loved. The money was tight, the bills piling up on the small table by the door, the formula cans emptying faster than she could replace them, the diapers disappearing in stacks as she counted each penny, each dollar, each moment where she had to choose between food for herself and formula for her daughters. She chose them every time, ignoring the hunger that gnawed at her, ignoring the dizziness that came when she stood too quickly, ignoring the cold that seeped into the apartment in the early hours of the morning when the heater struggled to keep the rooms warm. She found small joys in the quiet moments, in the way her daughters smiled in their sleep, in the softness of their hair against her cheek, in the tiny sounds they made as they breathed, reminding her that they were here, that they were alive, that they were hers. She sang to them, her voice soft and low, the words sometimes breaking as tears filled her eyes. But she kept singing, letting the sound fill the room, letting it wrap around them like a promise. When the loneliness threatened to swallow her, when the nights stretched long and dark, when the shadows in the corners seemed to whisper doubts and fears, she would sit by the window, one of the babies in her arms, watching the lights of the city, the cars moving along the streets, the people living lives she could only imagine. She would press her lips to her daughter's forehead, breathing in the warmth and the scent of baby powder, and she would remind herself that she was not alone, that they were with her, that they were enough. Amara began to find small ways to keep them fed, to keep the lights on, to keep the warmth in the rooms. She started making small bracelets and earrings at night, her fingers working quickly and carefully as the babies slept, using beads and threads she had found on sale, creating patterns that reminded her of the colors of the sky, of flowers, of dreams she once had. She sold them at the local market on weekends, standing behind a small table with a sign she had made from a piece of cardboard, smiling at the people who stopped to look, who asked about the babies, who sometimes bought a piece just to support her, pressing a few extra dollars into her hand with a kind word and a nod of understanding. She met neighbors who offered to help, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter who would watch the babies for an hour while Amara showered, who brought over warm meals when she could, who sat with Amara on the small couch, telling her stories about the old days, about the way she had raised her children, about the way women found strength when they needed it most. Amara listened, nodding, grateful for the company, grateful for the warmth of another voice in the apartment. There were days when it felt impossible, when the exhaustion was a weight she could not shake, when the cries of her daughters made her heart ache with the fear of not being enough, of not being able to give them what they deserved. She would sit on the floor, holding one of them close, rocking back and forth as tears slipped down her cheeks, whispering apologies she did not need to say, promises she would find a way to keep. But there were also days filled with laughter, small giggles that bubbled up as the babies began to notice the world around them, as they reached for each other, as they held hands while they slept, as they smiled at her with eyes so bright, so full of trust and love, that it made her believe in hope again. She learned to braid their hair, to dress them in matching outfits that made them giggle, to read them stories at night, their heads resting against her arms, as they drifted off to sleep. Amara found a rhythm in the chaos, a strength in the struggle, a love that grew deeper with each passing day. She began to believe that she could do this, that she could raise her daughters, that she could build a life for them, even if it was not the life she once dreamed of, even if it was not the life Trevor had promised. It was their life now, and it was enough. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Amara began to feel the stirrings of something she had thought she lost the day Trevor walked away. She began to feel hope, fragile but real, blooming in the quiet moments of the early morning, in the warmth of her daughter's hands in hers, in the soft, steady rhythm of their breathing as they slept beside her. She began to see the future not as a burden, but as a promise, one she would keep, one she would fight for, one she would live for. Because in the end, it was not the promises broken by others that defined her, but the promises she made to herself, to her daughters, to the life they would build together one day at a time, one breath at a time, one small, beautiful moment at a time. The morning light had changed in Amara's small apartment, shifting from the bleak, uncertain gray of survival into a softer gold that touched the floorboards and warmed the air as if recognizing the home they had built together. It was a modest home still, cluttered with small socks and scattered toys, but it was filled with the sounds of 4 small voices learning to speak, 4 pairs of small feet learning to walk, 4 little girls with laughter that made the walls feel less like walls and more like the safe cocoon Amara had fought to create. She would wake before dawn, her body conditioned to rise with the soft stirring of her daughters as they shifted in their small beds. Tiny limbs tangled together, breath warm and even, and for a moment she would watch them in the pale light, letting the quiet joy of their existence steady her before the work began. Amara's days became a rhythm of small victories. She had discovered, in the endless nights of rocking babies to sleep and sewing beads onto thin strings, that her hands could create beauty even when they trembled from exhaustion. Her jewelry, simple at first, bracelets with gentle colors, earrings shaped like tiny blossoms, began to catch the eyes of other mothers at the market who asked her where she found the time, how she managed to do it all, how she kept going. Amara would smile, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, her hands still busy arranging the pieces on the small folding table she set up every Saturday, and she would say quietly that she kept going because there was no other choice. Each Saturday, she would dress her daughters in matching dresses, their curls brushed and tied with ribbons she made from scraps of fabric, their shoes cleaned and lined up neatly by the door before they climbed into the borrowed stroller that had seen better days, but still carried them to the bus stop and then to the market. The girls would giggle and point at passing cars, at the dogs being walked on the sidewalks, at the pigeons that scattered when they stepped off the bus. It became their adventure, their tradition, the place where they saw their mother not just as the woman who sang to them at night and held them when they cried, but as the woman who stood behind a table of colors and light, smiling as strangers stopped to admire her work. Online, her small shop began to grow quietly, like a seed pushing through the soil in the early spring. She learned how to photograph her pieces using the soft light of morning, her daughters sometimes reaching tiny hands into the frame, their chubby fingers holding bracelets that caught the light like hope. She wrote simple captions, stories of the mornings spent making the jewelry while her daughters napped, stories of the way they all sang together when the work was done, stories of small joys and quiet triumphs. Women from across the city and then from other states began to notice, sending her messages of encouragement, placing orders, sharing her posts with words like strength, resilience, inspiration. In the evenings, after the girls were tucked into their beds, their hair still damp from baths, the scent of baby soap clinging to their curls, Amara would sit at her small table, stringing beads onto thin wire, her hands steady now with the certainty that she was building something lasting. Sometimes the girls would wake and toddle out of their room, rubbing sleep from their eyes, and she would lift them onto her lap, letting them watch as she worked, teaching them the names of the colors, the shapes of the stones, the patience it took to make something beautiful. It became their quiet ritual, a promise that even in the darkness of night, they could find light. There were days when Amara would still catch her reflection in the shop windows as she passed, a glimpse of herself with tired eyes and a body that still carried the softness of motherhood, and she would feel the sharp pang of memory, the echo of Trevor's laughter, the warmth of his arms around her, the whispered promises of forever that had once made her believe the world was safer than it was. But those days were becoming fewer, the sharpness of the memory softening into something she could hold without it breaking her open. She would look down at the small hand clutching hers, the light hair of her daughter catching the sun, the bright eyes looking up at her with trust and love, and she would remember why she kept moving forward. Trevor's presence in her mind became like a distant storm, something she could hear in the quiet moments when the girls asked why they didn't have a daddy like the other children, when she saw a father lift his child onto his shoulders at the market, when she caught the scent of a cologne that smelled like the one he used to wear. She would pause, letting the ache rise and fall like a wave, and then she would kneel in front of her daughters, brushing their hair back from their faces, telling them that their father had chosen a different path, but that it had nothing to do with them, that they were loved and wanted, that they were her greatest joy. As her business grew, Amara began to dream of more. She saved every extra dollar, tucking it into a jar she kept on a high shelf, a jar that became a symbol of the future she was building. She wanted to move into a space that was bigger than their small kitchen table, a place where she could create without worrying about waking the girls, a place where other women like her could come and learn, could sit together with their children playing nearby, could find hope in the steady rhythm of crafting something with their own hands. It was a dream that seemed impossible at times, but Amara had learned that impossible was just a word, and that she had already survived things others called impossible. The whispers of Trevor's new life reached her one day through the soft ping of a message on her phone. An old acquaintance from the neighborhood sent her a link, and Amara hesitated before opening it, her thumb hovering over the screen as her daughter's laughter echoed in the background. When she finally looked, she saw the photos of Trevor standing beside a young woman with long blonde hair and a bright, polished smile, a ring glittering on her finger as she leaned into him, her eyes filled with the easy confidence of someone who had never known what it meant to be left alone with 4 children in the middle of the night. They were engaged, the article said, planning a grand wedding at a church just outside the city, a wedding that promised to be a social event, filled with the powerful friends Trevor had gathered in the years since he walked away from the life he had started with Amara. The article spoke of his success, of the empire he was building, of the future he was claiming, and for a moment, Amara felt the sharp, familiar burn of betrayal in her chest, the taste of bitterness on her tongue as she set the phone down, her hands trembling. But then a small hand tugged at her skirt, a voice calling her name, and she looked down into the eyes of her daughter, who was holding up a bracelet she had made from leftover beads, the colors bright and clashing, the string tied in a messy knot, and the pride on her daughter's face was enough to wash the bitterness away. Amara knelt, taking the bracelet and slipping it onto her wrist, holding her daughter close as she whispered words of love into the soft hair that smelled of sunshine and soap. That night, as she lay in bed with the girls tucked close beside her, their soft breaths a lullaby that eased the tension from her shoulders, Amara made a decision. She would not let Trevor's choices define the life she was building, but she would no longer hide from the truth of what he had left behind. She would no longer carry the burden of his absence in silence, pretending it was not a wound that shaped them all. She would show her daughters that they were not something to be hidden, that their existence was not a secret, that they were a source of pride, of strength, of beauty. Amara's fingers traced the soft curls of her daughters as they slept, the light of the moon casting gentle shadows across their faces, and she let herself imagine the day she would stand, not in anger, not in vengeance but in truth, showing the world the family he had abandoned, the family she had saved, the family she had built from ashes into something unbreakable. And so, in the quiet of the night, with the scent of the girl's hair comforting her, Amara began to plan. She would take them, her daughters, her light, to the wedding Trevor was planning, to the place where he would stand and promise forever to another woman, to the place where he would pretend to be a man of honor and commitment. She would take them not to destroy, but to reveal, to show the world that while he had chosen to walk away, they had chosen to survive, to thrive, to stand tall in the face of every storm. It was not revenge that guided her, but the quiet certainty that her daughters deserved to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be known. They were not secrets. They were miracles. They were hers. As the first hints of dawn began to color the sky, Amara closed her eyes, the weight of exhaustion heavy, but no longer suffocating, her dreams filled with the vision of her daughters walking beside her, their heads held high, their small hands clutching hers, their eyes bright with the knowledge that they were loved, that they were wanted, that they were enough, because she was, and nothing, not Trevor, not the past, not the silence that had once threatened to drown her, could take that away from them now. The morning arrived with a hush that felt almost reverent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Amara rose before the first light had broken the horizon, the air in the apartment cool and still, the silence broken only by the soft breathing of her daughters, each curled in her small bed, tangled together like flower petals layered over one another. She stood at the edge of the room for a long moment, taking them in, the soft glow of the street lights through the curtains illuminating the delicate lines of their faces, the way their small hands reached for each other even in sleep, seeking comfort and closeness without even knowing it. The decision had been made, and there was no space left for fear. She had spent weeks preparing, each evening after her daughters fell asleep, as she sat at her table sorting beads and answering messages from customers, planning the details in quiet determination. She did not know what Trevor's face would look like when he saw them, whether he would turn pale or angry or try to hide the recognition that would bloom instantly the moment he saw the daughters he had abandoned standing there in front of him, living proof of the promises he had broken. She did not care. This was not about him, not really. It was about them, about the truth, about showing her daughters that they were not something to hide or be ashamed of, that their lives mattered enough to be seen, even if the man who had helped bring them into the world tried to pretend otherwise. She dressed them in soft cream dresses she had sewn herself, working through the nights under the dim glow of the lamp, each stitch a prayer, each seam a promise. The dresses were simple but beautiful, flowing just below their knees, allowing them to run and move as they always did, the fabric catching the light in a way that made them look almost ethereal. She braided their hair with small white ribbons, their soft golden curls falling down their backs, their bright eyes looking up at her with trust as she worked, their small voices chattering about the flowers they would see, the songs they would sing in the car, the stories they would tell on the way home. Amara herself, dressed in a navy dress, modest and strong, a color that made her feel steady, her natural curls pinned back to reveal the quiet strength in her face, the calm determination that had carried her through nights of hunger, days of fear, and the slow, painful birth of her independence. She slipped on the necklace she had made from leftover beads, each one a different shade of blue, each one a reminder of the pieces of herself she had gathered to build something whole again. She looked at herself in the mirror, seeing not the woman Trevor had left but the woman she had become, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to smile, to see the beauty in the lines around her eyes, the curve of her mouth, the softness in her gaze that had not been stolen by the world. The limousine arrived just as the first light turned the sky a pale pink, the engine humming quietly outside as the driver stepped out, a man with kind eyes who nodded to her, helping her buckle the girls into their seats, each one clutching a small stuffed animal for comfort. The girls were excited, their voices bright as they looked out the windows, pointing at the buildings as they passed, at the trees lining the streets, at the people walking dogs and sipping coffee, the city waking up around them as if it, too, was preparing for something important. Amara held their hands one by one, squeezing gently, her heart steady, her breathing calm, the weight of the day heavy but not crushing. As they approached the church, she saw the decorations first, the white flowers spilling down the steps, the strings of lights draped across the entrance, the small crowd of guests milling about in carefully chosen outfits, laughter and chatter rising in the morning air. The limousine slowed, pulling to the side, and the driver turned to look at her, his eyes asking the question she had already answered. She nodded once, firmly, and the door opened. One by one, the girls stepped out, their small hands reaching for hers, their eyes wide as they took in the scene before them. The guests turned, curiosity and confusion flickering across their faces as they took in the sight of Amara and her daughters, 4 small angels in cream dresses with matching ribbons in their hair, standing beside a woman who held herself with a quiet grace that made it impossible to look away. The whispers began, soft at first, then louder, as heads turned, eyes widening, hands clutching pearls and purses as they leaned toward one another to share the realization, the recognition that spread like ripples through the crowd. Inside, the music had begun, the gentle strains of strings floating through the open doors, the scent of flowers and candles drifting out to meet them as Amara stood at the edge of the walkway, taking in the sight of the church where Trevor would soon stand, waiting for a new beginning he believed to be untainted, unaware of the truth that was now stepping forward to meet him. Her daughters stood close to her, their small hands clutching at her dress, their eyes bright with curiosity, unaware of the tension that hummed in the air around them, unaware of the weight of the moment they were about to walk into. Amara held the envelope in her hand, the one she had prepared carefully, containing the photos of her daughters, the birth certificates with his name printed clearly, the letter she had written in the quiet of the night, explaining not with anger but with truth who they were, who he was, and what he had chosen to leave behind. She had not come to ruin a wedding or to scream in the middle of vows. She had come to be seen, to let her daughters be seen, to let them stand in the light without shame, without secrecy, without the burden of silence that had shaped their lives from the moment he walked away. She stepped forward, the girls moving with her, their small shoes tapping softly on the stone path, their dresses swaying around their legs as they approached the entrance. A wedding coordinator, her face pale with confusion, hurried forward, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hand as she stammered, asking if they needed help, if they were lost. Amara met her gaze calmly, the strength in her voice quiet but unyielding as she handed the envelope to the woman, asking her to give it to the groom, asking her to deliver the truth into the heart of a day built on a lie. The coordinator hesitated, looking down at the envelope, her eyes darting between Amara and the children, her lips parting as if to protest. But then she seemed to see something in Amara's eyes, something that silenced the question on her tongue, and she nodded, stepping back, clutching the envelope as she turned and hurried inside. Amara stood with her daughters at the edge of the walkway, the breeze lifting the curls around their faces, the sunlight catching the soft fabric of their dresses, turning them into small beacons of light against the backdrop of the carefully staged perfection of the wedding. The guests continued to whisper, some stepping back, others stepping closer, the realization dawning across their faces as they began to connect the pale hair of the girls, the curve of their smiles, the shape of their eyes, with the man who stood at the front of the church, waiting with a confident smile for a future he believed would never be touched by his past. The music paused, a moment of silence falling across the gathered crowd, and then Trevor stepped out into the doorway, his hand reaching for the woman beside him, the bride whose dress shimmered in the sunlight, her veil lifted just enough to reveal her bright, expectant smile. Trevor's eyes scanned the crowd, his smile wide, his posture confident, until they landed on Amara, standing there with their daughters, and in that instant, the confidence drained from his face, replaced by a pale, shocked recognition that made him freeze, his hand dropping from the bride's arm as he stared, unable to look away. Amara did not move, did not speak, did not cry. She stood there, her daughters beside her, the quiet dignity in her posture louder than any words could have been. The girls looked at him with the innocent curiosity of children meeting a stranger who felt strangely familiar, their bright eyes untainted by the betrayal that had brought them here, their small hands still clutching their stuffed animals as they waited. Trevor opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. The bride turned to look at him, confusion and concern in her eyes as she followed his gaze, her smile faltering as she took in the sight of the woman and the children standing at the edge of her perfect day, the reality of the moment sinking in as the whispers of the guests grew louder, the recognition spreading like a storm through the crowd. Amara held her daughter's hands, turning to look at each of them, giving them a small, reassuring smile, letting them know they were safe, they were loved, they were exactly where they were meant to be. She did not need to step forward any further. She did not need to say a word. The truth had arrived, and it stood in the light, unashamed, undeniable, unbreakable. As the church bells began to chime, ringing out over the soft chaos that now rippled through the wedding, Amara turned, guiding her daughters back toward the limousine, their small feet stepping confidently beside her, their dresses swaying in the morning breeze, the sunlight catching the smiles that bloomed on their faces as they walked away, leaving behind the silence of a man who had chosen to forget them, and now could no longer pretend they did not exist. Amara did not look back. She did not need to. The truth had been delivered, the moment had arrived, and as she lifted her daughters back into the limousine, buckling them into their seats, their voices bright with laughter as they asked if they could sing on the way home, she allowed herself to breathe, to feel the weight lifting from her shoulders, to let the warmth of the morning sun wash over her as the car pulled away from the place where her past had once tried to bury her. She held her daughters' hands, pressing gentle kisses to their foreheads as they drove away, the city passing by outside the windows, the future stretching before them, bright and waiting, a promise she would keep, a promise she had kept, a promise that was no longer hidden in the dark, but alive in the light of day where it belonged. The limousine glided away from the church with quiet precision, the hum of its engine blending with the distant toll of bells that faded into the morning air. Inside, Amara sat with her daughters, their small hands still warm in hers, the scent of baby powder and soft cotton filling the enclosed space as they shifted and chattered about the flowers they had seen, the lights, the people in beautiful clothes. They were untouched by the tension that had rippled through the wedding, unbothered by the frozen look on Trevor's face, the shocked whispers of the guests, the way the bride's hand had slipped from his arm as she realized the truth she had not been told. To her daughters, it had been an adventure, another day with their mother, a day when they wore dresses sewn with love and rode in a beautiful car that felt like a fairy tale. Amara let them keep that memory, let them hold on to the brightness of it, refusing to let the shadow of the past steal their joy. She watched them as they sang softly, a song they had made up about the colors of the ribbons in their hair, the sound of their voices wrapping around her like a promise that she was doing the right thing. The weight she had carried for so long, the secrecy, the burden of silence, had lifted the moment she stood on the steps of the church with them, letting the world see them, letting Trevor see them. She had not needed to say a word. The truth had spoken for itself, standing in the morning light with bright eyes and soft curls, undeniable, unashamed. She did not know what Trevor would do, what choices he would make now that the truth had been delivered into the carefully constructed world he had built, but it no longer mattered to her. Her duty was to her daughters, to their lives, to their dignity, and she had fulfilled it. As the limousine turned onto their street, the familiar sights of their neighborhood coming into view, Amara felt the shift in herself, the quiet settling of resolve that told her she could breathe again. The girls tumbled out of the car with the eager energy only children carried, running up the steps to their small apartment, calling for their toys, asking for snacks, laughter ringing out as they disappeared inside. Amara paid the driver, thanking him softly, and stood for a moment on the steps, looking out at the street, at the lives moving forward around her, feeling the sunlight warm her skin. It felt like a new chapter had begun, not with grand gestures or loud declarations, but with a simple, quiet moment of truth lived out in the open. Across the city, in a venue that was meant to house celebration and new beginnings, silence had fallen like a heavy curtain. The music that had played so confidently before now felt strained, the laughter that had once rung out now replaced by the low hum of anxious conversation, the sound of footsteps as guests shuffled, unsure whether to stay or leave. Trevor stood at the front of the church, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as they clenched and unclenched at his sides, the envelope Amara had sent still unopened, sitting on a small table beside the bouquets that now seemed too bright, too artificial in the dimming light of the room. The bride, her white dress trailing behind her like a ghost of a promise, stood to the side, her eyes fixed on Trevor with a mixture of confusion and growing anger. She had heard the whispers, seen the way the guests turned to look at the woman and the children who so clearly bore Trevor's features, seen the way Trevor's face drained of color, the way he had not been able to move, to speak, to deny what stood before him. The truth, once hidden away in the shadows of his ambition, now walked the halls of his carefully curated empire, and it had arrived with small feet and bright eyes, leaving no room for the lies he had built around himself. Outside the church, guests began to leave, their voices low, their eyes darting back toward the building, their conversations filled with speculation and questions. Phones buzzed quietly as photos were shared, as the story began to spread beyond the walls of the church, moving into the world where Trevor's reputation was currency, where the image he had cultivated so carefully now cracked under the weight of the reality he had abandoned years ago. Investors, who had once smiled and shook his hand, now raised eyebrows. Business partners, who had praised his commitment and stability, now questioned what else had been hidden, what other secrets might be waiting to surface. Inside, Trevor finally moved, reaching for the envelope with hands that betrayed the fear and confusion he tried to hide. He opened it, the paper trembling as he unfolded it, the photos of his daughters staring back at him with eyes that mirrored his own, the softness of their features undeniable, the curve of their smiles a reflection of his, the dates and details printed clearly on the documents beneath the photos leaving no room for denial. The letter, written in Amara's steady, careful handwriting, spoke not of blame or anger, but of truth, of the lives he had left behind, of the daughters who deserved to be seen, who deserved to be known, who deserved to live without the shadow of secrecy cast over them. Trevor's eyes moved over the words, the weight of them settling into his chest like a stone, the truth of his choices pressing down on him with a force he could not escape. The bride approached him, her face pale, her eyes demanding answers, her hands shaking as she reached for the papers he tried to hide, her voice rising in sharp, angry questions that filled the silent church. The guests who remained watched, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment, the story unfolding in real time before them, the carefully planned celebration now a stage for the reckoning Trevor had avoided for so long. He tried to speak, to form words that might ease the tension, that might explain away the reality standing before him, but the words died in his throat. The lies he had told for so long now sounding hollow even to his own ears. The bride's family stepped forward, their voices joining hers, demanding explanations, demanding truths, the chaos growing as the wedding that had been meant to solidify Trevor's image crumbled around him. News of the disruption spread quickly, the photos of Amara and the girls circulating through social media, shared by guests who could not resist the pull of the story unfolding in front of them. The images of the four girls, standing in their cream dresses, their small hands holding Amara's, their bright eyes and soft curls reflecting the man who had abandoned them, became symbols of a truth that could no longer be ignored. The whispers of scandal turned to statements of fact, the narrative shifting from speculation to certainty, the cracks in Trevor's empire widening as the world learned of the life he had chosen to leave behind. At home, Amara turned off her phone, silencing the notifications, choosing instead to sit with her daughters as they played on the floor, building towers from blocks, dressing dolls in small clothes, their laughter filling the room with a warmth that had nothing to do with the chaos unfolding elsewhere. She watched them, her heart steady, her mind calm, knowing she had done what she needed to do, knowing she had given them the gift of truth, the freedom to live without secrets, the dignity to stand in the light of who they were. The girls came to her, one by one, crawling into her lap, pressing their small hands against her cheeks, their eyes bright as they told her stories of the day, of the flowers, of the lights, of the way the world looked from the windows of the limousine. They did not speak of Trevor, did not ask about the man who had stared at them with shock and fear, did not wonder about the chaos they had left behind. To them, it was a day of adventure, a day with their mother, a day when they wore dresses sewn with love and felt the warmth of the sun on their faces as they stood in the light, unashamed. Amara held them close, pressing kisses to their foreheads, breathing in the scent of their hair, letting the weight of the day settle into her bones as something that was no longer heavy, no longer a burden, but a marker of freedom. She had faced the past, she had spoken the truth, and now she could let it go, knowing that the future was theirs to claim, a future built not on secrets and shame, but on honesty, on love, on the quiet strength that had carried them through the darkest nights. Across the city, Trevor sat alone in the dim light of the now empty church, the papers in his hands, the images of the daughters he had tried to forget staring back at him, demanding to be seen, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding the truth he had refused to face. The bride was gone, the guests were gone, the music silenced, the celebration turned to dust. The empire he had built on image and ambition now stood on foundations cracked by the truth, the weight of his choices pressing down on him as he realized the life he had walked away from had found him, and there was no running from it now. In the small apartment, as the night settled in and the city lights glowed softly beyond the windows, Amara tucked her daughters into their beds, their small bodies curling under the blankets, their breaths steady and calm. She sat by the window, the moonlight casting gentle shadows across the room, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to exhale, to let go of the fear, to let go of the burden, to let herself believe in the quiet, steady promise of tomorrow. The empire had cracked, the truth had been seen, and in the soft glow of the moonlight, Amara finally felt free. The morning after the wedding passed quietly in Amara's small apartment, the early light filtering softly through the curtains, casting warm gold across the beds where her daughters slept, tangled together under light blankets, their breaths slow and even, the gentle rise and fall of their small chests, the rhythm that had kept Amara anchored through sleepless nights. She stood for a long moment in the doorway, her hands resting lightly on the frame, watching them, letting the calm of their presence settle into her bones as the sounds of the waking world drifted in through the open window. Birds called to one another in the trees that lined the street, the distant hum of cars layered with the faint scent of fresh rain on the pavement, and for the first time in years, Amara let herself stand still, breathing in the quiet, allowing herself to feel the peace that had come in the aftermath of truth. The day before had been a storm, not loud with screaming or bitter words, but powerful in the way the truth had walked calmly into a place built on lies and sat down, unashamed, unmovable. Amara had not needed to speak, had not needed to shout, because the truth had been clear in the bright eyes of her daughters, in the way they had held her hands, in the way they had looked around with curiosity and innocence that nothing could taint. She had watched Trevor's face drain of color, had seen the way the bride's laughter faltered, had seen the way the guests turned, whispering, pointing, their eyes moving from her daughters to Trevor, putting together the pieces of the story he had tried to bury beneath polished shoes and pressed suits. She had felt the weight of years lift from her shoulders in that moment, the burden of secrecy dissolving under the light of day, leaving behind a space that she could now fill with hope. Amara turned from the doorway, stepping lightly so as not to wake them, moving into the kitchen where the kettle steamed on the small stove, the scent of tea rising with the warmth of the air. She wrapped her hands around the cup, feeling the heat seep into her skin, grounding her, reminding her of the simple joys she had fought to preserve in their lives. The soft clink of the spoon against the ceramic was the only sound as she stirred in a bit of honey, the sweetness melting into the warmth, filling the room with a comfort that felt earned. The girls woke slowly, one by one, blinking sleep from their eyes, stretching their arms toward her with the trust that came so naturally to them, trust that had been built in the quiet moments, in the stories read before bed, in the songs sung to chase away bad dreams, in the steady presence of a mother who had chosen them every day without hesitation. They tumbled into the kitchen, their hair still mussed from sleep, the ribbons from the day before tucked carefully in a small jar on the counter, waiting to be worn again for another day of games and laughter. They clung to her legs as she moved, their small voices asking about breakfast, about whether they could go to the park, about whether they could paint later, their words spilling over each other in the way only children's words could, unfiltered, full of life. She made them breakfast, the small table crowded with plates of fruit, slices of warm toast, a jar of jam that stuck to their fingers as they ate, their giggles filling the room as they fed each other small bites, their laughter rising above the sound of the radio playing softly in the background. Amara watched them, her heart full, her mind calm, the chaos of the world outside irrelevant in the safety of this moment, in the peace of knowing that she had given them the gift of living without shame. The day unfolded slowly, the sun climbing higher in the sky as they dressed in simple clothes, the girls helping each other button small shirts, pulling on socks, tying shoes with careful fingers, celebrating each success with small claps and squeals of delight. Amara packed a small bag with snacks and a blanket, gathering their paints and brushes, their small sketchbooks filled with colorful scribbles and careful letters, their names written over and over as they practiced, taking pride in each letter formed, each word learned. They walked to the park, the air warm with the promise of summer, the scent of flowers drifting on the breeze as the girls ran ahead, their laughter trailing behind them like a bright ribbon, their hair catching the sunlight, turning their curls into halos as they moved. Amara followed, her steps unhurried, her eyes on them, the smile on her lips soft and steady as she watched them climb the small hill, turning back to wave, their voices calling for her to hurry, to come and see the view from the top. They sat on the blanket, the paints spread out between them, the girls dipping brushes into colors that smeared across the pages, turning white paper into bright stories of their world. They painted flowers and suns, trees and houses, small figures with curly hair and wide smiles, stick arms reaching out to hold hands, hearts drawn in pinks and reds around the edges of the pages. Amara painted with them, her strokes careful, her colors chosen with the quiet intention of showing them how beauty could be found in the smallest details, in the blending of colors, in the patience of waiting for the paint to dry before turning the page. They ate their snacks, fruit and small sandwiches, crumbs gathering on their dresses, their fingers sticky with juice, their faces bright with the simple joy of being outside, of being together. They lay back on the blanket, looking up at the sky, finding shapes in the clouds, calling out their discoveries with excitement, arguing playfully about whether a shape was a dragon or a horse, a flower or a bird, their laughter mixing with the breeze, carrying away the last remnants of the tension that had once filled their days. Amara watched them, her heart steady, her breathing calm, the peace of the moment sinking into her, reminding her that she had done the right thing, that she had chosen the right path, that she had given them a life that was theirs, unburdened by the weight of secrets. She thought of Trevor, of the chaos that would be unfolding in his world, of the questions he would now have to answer, of the image he had built now, cracking under the truth that had walked into his wedding with bright eyes and small hands, and she felt no bitterness, no anger, only a quiet release, a letting go of the past that had tried to define her. They returned home as the sun began to set, the sky painted in soft oranges and pinks, the air cooling as the day shifted into evening. The girls were tired, their steps slower, their voices softer as they held her hands, leaning against her legs as they walked, their small bodies warm against her as they climbed the steps to their apartment. She bathed them, the scent of soap and warm water filling the small bathroom as they splashed and giggled, their hair curling again in the steam, their eyes drooping as they yawned, the day's adventures catching up to them. They dressed in soft pajamas, their small bodies curling into the blankets as she read them a story, her voice gentle, the words wrapping around them like a lullaby, their eyes closing as they drifted into sleep, their breathing even, their faces peaceful. Amara sat with them for a while, her hand resting on the curve of a small back, feeling the rise and fall of each breath, letting the calm of the moment fill her, letting herself believe in the promise of tomorrow. Later, as the apartment settled into the quiet of the night, Amara stepped out onto the small balcony, the air cool against her skin, the city lights blinking softly in the distance, the hum of cars passing like a steady heartbeat beneath the world. She stood there, her arms wrapped around herself, the weight of the day settling into her muscles, the peace of her choices wrapping around her like a blanket. She thought of the future, of the days ahead, of the life she would continue to build for her daughters, of the dreams she would help them chase, of the love she would continue to give them freely, fiercely, without fear. The empire that Trevor had built had begun to crack, the truth of his choices coming to light, the reality of the life he had left behind, now shaping the narrative he could no longer control. Amara did not rejoice in his downfall, did not seek satisfaction in his struggle, because her focus was no longer on him, no longer on the past that had once held her back. Her focus was on the girls sleeping in their beds, on the quiet moments of peace she had fought to create, on the small victories of each day, on the love that grew stronger with every sunrise. She turned back to the apartment, closing the door behind her, the night wrapping around them like a promise of rest, of dreams, of tomorrow. She moved through the small rooms, checking on her daughters, tucking blankets around their shoulders, pressing soft kisses to their foreheads, whispering words of love that they would carry with them into their dreams. She lay down in her own bed, the weight of the day lifting from her shoulders as she closed her eyes, letting herself drift into sleep, the last thought in her mind the soft, steady truth that she had given them a life built on love, on honesty, on the quiet strength that came from surviving and choosing to thrive. Amara slept peacefully that night, the calm of her choices settling around her, the empire outside cracking under its own weight while within her small apartment, in the soft breathing of her daughters, in the quiet of her own heart, a new kingdom was being built, one that could not be broken, one that would stand, one that would carry them forward into the dawn. Dawn arrived without fanfare, sliding into the room through the thin curtains with a gentle light that touched the floorboards and crept up to where Amara lay, eyes open, listening to the morning breath of her daughters. They slept, curled around each other in the quiet dawn, the smallest hand resting across a sister's shoulder, tiny fingers curling unconsciously in sleep, the shared warmth of their bodies comforting even in dreams. The stillness of the moment filled Amara, grounding her in a peace she had once believed was only for others, something women with easier lives could claim without fighting for it. Yet, here it was, this small, ordinary peace, resting in her bones as she rose from her bed and moved through the apartment, letting the light guide her into the day. In the kitchen, she prepared breakfast, her movements slow and deliberate, the soft sound of the kettle and the clinking of spoons against bowls, the soundtrack of a life that had taken shape from the ashes of all she had lost. Each task was small and familiar, the rhythm of them reminding her how far she had come from the chaos of those first days alone, from the fear that had kept her awake at night, wondering how she would feed 4 small mouths, how she would build a future with nothing but her hands and a will that had refused to break. Now the fear was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that whatever came, she could meet it with steady hands and a heart that would not abandon the life she had chosen to protect. The girls awoke to the smell of oatmeal and warm fruit, shuffling into the kitchen with sleepy eyes and soft yawns, rubbing the dreams from their faces before climbing into their chairs, their small voices greeting her with the trust that had never wavered, even when the world tried to teach them otherwise. They spoke of the day before, of the flowers they had seen in the park, the pictures they had painted, the way the sun had felt warm on their faces as they lay on the blanket, pointing out shapes in the clouds. They did not speak of the man who had stared at them in stunned silence on the steps of a church, who had been forced to see what he had chosen to leave behind. To them, that day was not about him. It was about the adventure of wearing dresses sewn by their mother, about riding in a shiny car, about standing in the sunlight together. It was about being seen, but not for him, for themselves. Amara listened as they spoke, their voices rising and falling with the excitement of small children, their words tangled and bright, reminding her of all the reasons she had chosen this life, of the reasons she had chosen to stand in the light with them rather than remain hidden in the shadows of someone else's choices. She helped them braid their hair, tying ribbons carefully, pressing soft kisses to their foreheads as they giggled and wriggled, eager to begin another day. Outside, the world moved on, as it always did. The streets were busy with the rhythm of daily life, cars moving in slow streams, people walking with purpose, the sounds of a city living through another morning. Amara moved through it with her daughters, their hands in hers, small fingers clutching her palms as they crossed streets, as they stepped into the small grocery store to buy fruit and bread, as they stopped to look at flowers in the window of a shop, the girls pointing and asking the names of each bloom, their eyes wide with wonder. She answered each question patiently, letting them touch the petals when the shopkeeper smiled and offered them to the girls, watching as they smelled the flowers with delight before returning them carefully. At home, the girls played in the small living room, building towers from blocks, dressing dolls in clothes they had made from scraps of fabric, their laughter spilling into the room and filling it with warmth. Amara watched them as she worked on her jewelry orders, the beads moving through her fingers with a confidence that had become second nature. Her hands sure as she created pieces that would soon find homes with women who had come to admire not just the beauty of the pieces, but the story behind them. Each bracelet, each necklace was a testament to survival, to growth, to the quiet victory of a woman who had chosen to rise instead of break. News of Trevor's crumbling image reached her in small whispers, passed along through neighbors who still followed the stories that circled the city, who spoke in low voices about the empire that was beginning to crack under the weight of the truth that had arrived with 4 small girls and the mother who stood behind them. His business deals were faltering, his partners questioning his character, the public image he had worked so carefully to build, now marked by the reality of the choices he had made. The family he had abandoned, now shaping the narrative he could no longer control. Amara listened politely when neighbors tried to share the gossip, offering small nods and kind smiles, but she did not linger on the details, did not need the validation of his downfall to know her worth, to feel the strength of what she had built. Trevor's world was crumbling, but Amara's was thriving in the quiet corners of a small apartment, filled with laughter, with the gentle hum of life lived honestly, with the peace of knowing that she had done what needed to be done, not out of revenge, but out of love for her daughters, out of the promise she had made to them to live in truth, to never let them believe they were a secret to be hidden. She did not wish him pain, nor did she wish him happiness, because it no longer mattered to her what became of the man who had chosen to walk away. Her energy was no longer spent looking back at the door he had closed. It was focused on the future, on the small hands that reached for hers each day, on the bright eyes that looked to her for guidance, on the hearts she had been entrusted to protect and nurture. Evenings became moments of gratitude. The girls, sitting around the small table, their heads bent over coloring books, crayons moving across pages in bright strokes as Amara prepared dinner. The scent of warm bread and simmering vegetables filling the room. They shared stories of their day, the girls speaking of the colors they had discovered, the words they had learned, the games they had played, their voices overlapping with the ease of siblings who knew they were loved, who knew they were safe. Amara listened, offering small words of encouragement, laughter at their jokes, comfort when one of them grew frustrated with a drawing that did not turn out as planned. She was there, present in every moment, the quiet strength of her love weaving itself into the fabric of their lives. At night, after stories were read and songs were sung, after the girls had drifted into sleep, their breathing soft and steady in the darkness, Amara would sit by the window, looking out at the city lights blinking softly in the distance, the hum of the world a quiet backdrop to her thoughts. She would hold a cup of tea, letting the warmth seep into her hands, grounding her as she allowed herself to think of the journey that had brought her here, of the moments when she thought she would break, of the nights when she had held her daughters close and promised them that they would be okay, even when she was not certain of it herself. She would think of the day she stood on the steps of the church, of the calm in her heart as the truth unfolded, as her daughters stood beside her, unashamed, unafraid, the reality of who they were undeniable in the light of day. And she would smile, not with triumph over Trevor's collapse, but with the quiet victory of a woman who had chosen to keep moving, who had chosen to keep loving, who had chosen to build a life worth living despite the storms that had threatened to take everything from her. She had built a kingdom in the small rooms of a modest apartment, a kingdom where laughter was currency, where love was the foundation, where truth was the air they breathed. She had built a life for her daughters that was free of shame, free of secrecy, a life where they could grow into women who would know their worth, who would know they were loved beyond measure, who would know that strength was not in never falling, but in rising each time they did. The empire Trevor had tried to build was cracking, but in its shadow Amara had built something stronger, something that could not be taken from her, something that would stand long after the last whispers of scandal faded into the past. She had built a life rooted in love, in honesty, in the quiet moments of connection with her daughters, in the small victories that came each day, in the resilience that grew each time she chose to rise instead of surrender. And so she sat in the quiet of the night, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, the soft breaths of her daughters reminding her of the reason she had fought so hard, the reason she would continue to fight, the reason she would continue to choose hope, to choose love, to choose the promise of tomorrow. She was no longer defined by what had been done to her, no longer defined by the man who had walked away. She was defined by the love she had given, by the strength she had found, by the daughters who would carry her legacy of courage and truth into the world. In the hush of that night, Amara allowed herself to exhale, to let go of the last fragments of fear that had once clung to her, to embrace the peace she had earned. She turned from the window, moving through the small apartment, checking on her daughters one last time, pressing soft kisses to their foreheads, whispering promises of love into their dreams. She lay down in her bed, the weight of the day lifting from her shoulders, the promise of tomorrow waiting for her as she closed her eyes. A quiet victory wrapped around her like the soft warmth of dawn. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more and check out our other videos for stories that will keep you thinking. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.